This is the first of my videos in association with ephotozine.com. I'm hoping it won't be the last, and it's my take on the 60mm f2.8 Olympus macro lens. I bought it to replace a Sigma 105mm f2.8 macro lens, which I bought originally for my DSLR. The Sigma with MFT adapter was manual focus and manual exposure and a bit bulky and a bit too long on MFT bodies at an equivalent 210mm, a 4x telephoto. Then along came the first proper macro for MFT, the Panasonic Leica 45mm f2.8. Fabulous performance but very expensive. I would have bought one except that I already had a 45mm lens, the Olympus 45mm f2.8. But I also find the 45mm focal length, 90mm in full frame, a bit too short for macro in general. Fine for small inanimate subjects, but even insects are spooked by a lump of glass pointing up their sparacle from a few millimetres away. Then along came the 60mm Olympus. The Sigma was a big lump and was awkward to use, especially with a flash mounted on the front. I hung on for a while but eventually succumbed to lens fever once again. The Olympus promised an easier macro experience and hasn't let me down. It's another one of Olympus's dog's long, thin, ugly lenses, and it doesn't come with a lens hood or bag, which it should at its price, around £360, €500 or $500. Olympus charge you over £50 for a hood, but identical aftermarket ones are available for a quarter of that. Shameful. Anyway, pick it up, and it is obviously a quality item. It has that machine from metal taut quality to it that makes Olympus Prime so attractive, yet without actually being heavy, rather like the 17mm f1.8. In fact, it is plastic with a metal mount. It's sealed against dust and damp, and the front lens doesn't rotate or extend when focusing. It makes the use of ring flash, so useful for macro, very easy. Internal focusing is excellent on a macro lens, no danger of misjudging distance and racking the lens out and biffing your subject. Doesn't matter with a flower, but whacking a wasp with a chunk of glass does tend to bring thoughts of revenge into its mind. Seriously, it's a big plus. My Sigma macro extended by several inches at 1:1 and it was a nuisance. On this lens there's a window with focusing scale on the top with reproduction ratios marked on it, and the lens focus action is silky smooth and beautifully weighted, which with the wide focusing ring makes manual focusing a pleasure. It's about 5.5 turns from infinity to minimum focus, but it takes only one turn to cover the range of a non-macro lens. The ring doesn't have stops at 1:1 or infinity, so continues turning. That's why it needs the 1:1 focus setting position on the switch to avoid any uncertainty. When you get to reproduction ratios of 25% life size or more, depth of field starts to narrow drastically, and you really need that 4 turns of fine and smooth control over it. There's a focus limiter switch on the lens too. It's very necessary because if a macro lens has to search for focus across the entire focusing range, that is a much greater span than with a non-macro and will take much longer. Sometimes in dim light this lens will hunt for focus, so you need to limit it. If you're using the lens as a short telephoto, the 0.4 meters to infinity setting gives you all the focal range you'll need and results in autofocus performance comparable with most other modern MFT lenses, if not notably fast. Being Olympus, it isn't stabilised on Panasonic bodies except for the GX7, and even then not for video. With Olympus bodies you have the in-body stabilisation of course. So to performance. A macro lens is not just a lens with an extended close focus range. That's what you get when you buy a so-called macro zoom. Macro really means a lens capable of 1:1 at least reproduction. It also implies a lens with minimal distortion, where parallel lines remain parallel, and with sharpness optimised for close focusing distances, essentially a lens for scientific and recording purposes. A smaller sensor format like MFT is not ideal for macro in that it cannot record anything larger than the sensor itself at life size. Here is a ruler at 1:1 scale on the Olympus lens. It records a width just over 17mm across, the size of the sensor of course. On a full frame camera it will record twice that width for logical reasons. So, if you were photographing a creature 36mm long, you could photograph all of it at life size on full frame, but only half life size on MFT. Here's a comparison between the 45mm f1.8 at f2.8 and the 60mm at f2.8 at the 45mm closest focus. You can see that the 60mm is much better at f2.8 close-up than the 45mm, as it should be. That's what it's designed for. There is no bowing out of the outer markings with the 60mm. It's hardly noticeable with the 45mm, but the 60mm is better still. The tables are turned at normal distances in f5.6, where the 45mm is better. However, the distance is pretty academic, and most people's judgment will be that the 60mm is just as good as the 45mm. For landscape and architectural photography, at f5.6 this lens is equally crisp right across the frame and is distortion free, no bowed vertical lines and no vignetting. Purple fringing exists under high contrast edge conditions, but not at problematical levels, and is easily eliminated if necessary. Personally, I use this lens at f2.8 for both close work and general purposes when I need to, and I do not have any qualms about the edge-to-edge sharpness whatsoever. For portraiture, I think I might prefer this 60mm focal length to 45mm. If you're doing upright portraits especially, 60mm gives a very comfortable working distance from your subject. The 45mm wide open at f1.8 does have a creamier out of focus quality though. The focus limiting switch is very handy. It's great to push it forward and know you're at 1:1 closest focus. I like to set it to 1:1 and then switch to manual focus. At that point, focus is easiest by moving the camera backwards and forwards. With this lens, as with any other at very close focus distances, there is hardly any depth of field. Sometimes, as with this praying mantis, the shallow depth of field works to enhance the picture, but mostly you want more of the subject in focus. One way around that is to shoot at f16 or f22, but with MFT lenses you are way past the lens's sweet spot, and the results can be quite soft. Generally about f4 or 5.6 is the sweet spot. This softness at small apertures is a fact of optics. It can't be designed out. However, you don't buy a macro lens like this for soft results. A better way is to use focus stacking if your imaging software has it. In Photoshop it's done by photo merge. Take several shots at say f5.6, moving the focus back a little each time. Then have your software stitch all the shots together. You can't do it with anything moving about, of course, and in that case I find the best compromise is f11, high ISO and shoot away. 60mm isn't a particularly useful length for general video, but if you do macro video, note that the focusing on this lens is basically silent. To sum up, I find this lens impressively fit for purpose. It was obviously designed from the ground up as a macro lens for digital cameras, so you have full automation, TTL flash, autofocus and auto exposure, and it works seamlessly. But in pure macro photography, many photographers advocate manual everything. Switch off the automation and you have a classic macro lens, albeit smaller and handier than its DSLR predecessors. If you are chasing uncooperative bugs around the place, smaller and handier translates to more pictures in focus. The automation makes an area of photography that could seem clunky and annoying into something that can be done casually and is fun. And it stimulates the imagination because big or small, if you can see it, you know you can photograph it. I like to photograph flowers at wide apertures and ultra close-up. It's almost an impressionistic view, and you never really know what it will look like until you see it on your full-size screen. After all, with an image of something 17mm across, filling a screen 24 or so inches across, you are viewing it at more than 30 times life size. Here's a short video of a dragonfly. You don't strictly need a macro lens for this, but you do need a lens that will close focus, and this 60mm is the obvious one to pick up, because you might just get the chance to move right in on the animal. Like I said, it makes you want to do this stuff. If you aren't interested in macro, the Olympus 45mm f1.8 is a better buy, but if you are, this lens is a must-have. If you are thinking of the Panasonic 45mm f2.8, I would point out that for a matter of £20 more at UK prices, you could buy the Olympus 45mm and this macro lens. The Panasonic is stabilised, of course, and has technically better sharpness. But even if it and the Olympus were similarly priced, I would go for the Olympus simply because of the extra focal length. Here's the lens at closest focus with a live image shown on my iPad behind. By the way, I title this simply War, What Is It Good For? Still Life with Forget-Me-Not and .5-inch General Purpose Machine Gun Round, London 2014. I await the call from the Tate Modern, the Guggenheim and the Louvre. Seriously, Olympus put a lot of thought into the design of this lens, and it has paid off. It makes macro photography intuitive and enjoyable and produces superb image quality, both for its intended use and general purpose short tele work. I should add that if you want a lens only for serious tripod mounted technical work, you should consider a legacy film macro lens adapted to MFT, since its manual only mode won't be a disadvantage and you'll save a lot of money. I'll finish with a quick tip. If you're doing critical work of, say, a chart or document with a lens like this, it is important that it should be squarely lined up with your subject. I find the easiest way is to put a mirror in place of the subject and adjust the camera position until the reflection of your lens is centered on screen. You are now square on. For additional information and up-to-date pricing on this lens, please go to ephotozine.com. And thanks for watching.